We're in part 5 of 6 in a series on how to live fearless lives. And last week we looked at one of the most helpful principles I discovered, and that is the principle I called do it scared, do it afraid. That when God comes to someone and says, do not fear, what he usually means, as he meant, I think in the case of Mary, was embrace the fear and do it anyway. Embrace the fear and do it anyway. One of the verses we could have looked at, should have looked at probably, but didn't do so, is Joshua 3:15 and 16. Now the Jordan is at flood state all during the harvest. Yet, as soon as the priest who carried the ark reached the Jordan, and their feet touched the water's edge, the water didn't part till their feet got wet. And the water won't part for you until your feet get wet. Their feet touched the water's edge. The water from upstream stopped flowing. But it raises the question, well, what if I fail? What if I do it afraid, and what if I fail? Well, let's look at a passage that deals with that. Matthew 14, beginning in verse 22, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of time to the other side where he dismissed the crowd. The story is going to be the story of Peter walking on the water and then sinking into the water and failing in that sense. And so you want to look at this verse and ask the question, what does this verse tell you about failure? After he dismissed them, he went up to the mountainside by himself to pray. And I'd ask the question, what do we learn about prayer from that verse right there? Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted, you might look at that in 2 or 3 different translations, beat up by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, presumably he left them just before sunset. Now it's just before dawn. Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. And by the way, they weren't terrified when the storm came. They were used to that. They were fishermen, many of them, and they were used to dealing with storms. But when they saw Jesus walking on the lake, they became terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Lord, if it is you, Peter replied, tell me, command me, some translations have it, command me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, give you some sense of the size of this boat, because he had to get down out of the boat, and he walked on the water, and he came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, when he took his eyes off Jesus, and he saw the wind, he was then afraid, and as soon as he began to sink, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. I like to call that the most efficient prayer in all the Bible. Sometimes prayers don't have to be long. Lord, saved me. We think of prayers, we think, Lord, bless us this day, and thank you for what you provided for us, and be with so-and-so as they travel, and so on. Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. And I want to say, I believe this is where Jesus has been trying to lead his disciples all the way along, that they would see him as God, a very God, that they would worship him. That phrase may not mean that much to us in that we're used to it, but the Jews understand very clearly that you don't worship anybody except God. And they worshiped him and said, truly you are the Son of God. All right, 7 observations. The first one is this: storms are a part of following God. Scripture says immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. It's not a story. It's not the story of Jonah, for example, of someone wandering from God, rebelling against God, and then they found themselves in a storm. This is someone who is in the middle of God's will, which reminds us that in this world you will have trouble. And so often you hear the story of someone who begins following God, and then trouble comes their way, and they say, why did this happen to me, Lord? I thought I was following you. I thought I was doing what you thought. But storms are a part of following God. So we want to get the principle, then we want to illustrate. You could illustrate this in 1,000 ways, in a personal story, in some other story. I'm going to look at a biblical story, Acts 16. After Paul had seen the vision, this great Macedonian vision, we got it ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding. I love that word right there because it tells us something about following God that you don't always know for sure. but they concluded that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. And they are in this area of Mysia, and they start heading one direction, and the angel says no, and they start heading another direction, the angel says no, they start heading another direction, the angel says no, and then they get this vision to go over to Philippi. And when they get to Philippi, wonderful things happen. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer of purple and cloth. She was a worshiper of God, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, glory be. We go down a few more verses and then we read this. The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. What happened? I didn't think this happened when you followed God. This is what happens when you follow God. Storms are a part of following God. Second observation, the mountains are a wonderful place to pray. And this is one of the things I love about small groups, is that your life experience informs your understanding of Scripture. I would have never seen this insight until a few years ago. I started spending a few hours every day out in the hills and spending time with God in audio. And you discover out there what Jesus knew, and that is that mountains are a wonderful place to discover God, to pray. After he dismissed them, he went up to a mountainside by himself to pray. Luke 6:12 says one of those days Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. Another verse says Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. One day, Jesus was praying in a particular place, a certain place. And the idea is this, as Mark Batterson says it, geography and spirituality are not unrelated. And for many of us, we pray well when we get out on the side of a mountain somewhere. Observation number 3, Jesus' rescue is not always immediate. Notice that word, shortly before dawn. Literally the fourth watch of the night. Of course, they didn't have watches on particularly, so they divided the night into two parts first, the early part of the night and the last part. And then there's the early part of the early part and the later part of the first part. And then there's the first part of the last part and the second part of the last part. And so that comes up with 4 different parts of the night. And they don't know exactly what this time it is. But it is in the fourth watch of the night, meaning it is probably shortly before dawn. I think that is really good translation. And the point is that Jesus dismissed the crowd just before sunset, and so maybe it's been 8 or 10 hours now. And the application is Jesus does not always rescue at once. Can we find another passage that deal with this? Well, I found this passage, John 11, 5 and 6. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, and I'm going to misquote this verse right here, by the way. See if you can tell where I've misquoted it. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he left immediately to be with them. Did you notice what I misquoted? It's not actually what the verse says. What the verse says was, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And it reminds us that the heavens are higher than the earth. So are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. And his rescue is not always immediate. Observation number 4, if you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. John Ortberg has a wonderful book based on this story, and he says, I believe there is someone inside of us who tells us that there is more to life than sitting in the boat, and more than merely avoiding failure. There is something inside you that wants to walk on the water, to leave the comfort of your routine existence and abandon yourself to the high adventure of following God. So let me ask you a very important question. What is your boat? What is your safety zone? And God is calling you outside of that safety zone. Your boat is whatever represents safety and security to you apart from God himself. Your boat is whatever you are tempted to put your trust in, especially when life gets stormy. Your boat is whatever keeps you so comfortable that you don't want to give it up, even if it's keeping you from joining Jesus on the waves. Your boat is whatever pulls you away from the high adventure of extreme discipleship. Want to know what your boat is? Your fear will tell you. Just ask yourself this. What is it that most produces fear in me, especially when I think of leaving that behind? And if you're not sure what getting out of the boat means, I'd like to invite you to consider this. I would invite you to consider embracing the vision of living out 2 Timothy 2:2. 2 Timothy 2:2 says, the things you heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others. And it has to do with a doubling group. And if you don't have any other vision, I would invite you to embrace this vision of giving your one and only life to the vision of a group doubling every 2 years or less. A group that doubles every 18 months. A group of 10 that doubles every 18 months will reach 1,000 people for God in 10 years. And I would invite you to embrace that vision and get out of your boat of a comfortable group of us four, no more, same as before, and embrace the vision of your group attempting before God, in the power of God, to doubling every 2 years or less. Observation number 5, we fail when we concentrate on the wind. When he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. He saw the wind, he felt afraid, he began to sink, and he asked for help. And instead of looking at the waves, instead of looking at the wind, what are we to do? We are to look at whatever's true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable. If anything is excellent or pure, think about, look at those things. All right, what have we seen so far? First, storms are a part of following Jesus. Secondly, the mountains are a wonderful place to pray. Third observation, Jesus' rescue is not always immediate. And fourth observation, if you want to walk on water, you have to get out of the boat. And number five, we fail when we concentrate on the wind. Observation number 6, failure is not final. Talking about feeling the fear and doing it anyway, and asking the question, what if we fail? And the answer is, failure is not final. When he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And he immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? I quote a lot of different authors when I teach, and this time I'm going to quote myself. And in my book, You Can Double Your Class in 2 Years or Less, I say, one of the major themes of the Bible is this: failure is not final. We can risk failure because we know that God is a God of second chances. We can recover from failure because we know that God forgives and restores. Perhaps there was a time in your life when you sought to do great things for God, but you failed miserably. Maybe you discovered that it is easier to quit dreaming than to keep failing. I have good news for you. Failure is not final. I invite you to become a dreamer again. Dream with me about a better nation and a better world. Dream with me about being part of an army that makes that happen. Consider the story of Jonah. The prophet Jonah was called by God to be a missionary to the city of Nineveh, sort of an ancient version of Las Vegas. But when Jonah disobeyed God, he ended up in the belly of a fish with seaweed wrapped around his face. I suspect he felt like a failure, and to be honest, at that point, he was a failure. But failure is not final. God is a God of the second chance. Because we are secure in our relationship with Christ, because we know that he will forgive us when we need it, because we know he believes in us, we have the security to risk failure. So I encourage you to try something that may not work. You never know. It just might work. I would not have given you a nickel on a dollar that we would, and I'm talking about my experience back at Calvary Baptist Church back in the day, but anyway, I would not give you a nickel on a dollar that we would ever sustain a Sunday school class that met at 7:30 a.m. on Sunday morning. I thought it was a terrible idea. Somebody else had this idea. They came to me, let's start at 7:30 a.m. The church was growing and running out of space, and I was looking at thinking about starting new Sunday schools and new classes and so on. And someone came to me with this idea, let's start a new class. It starts at 7:30 in the morning. And I remember thinking to myself, that is a terrible idea. But it hasn't failed. In fact, it has served a tremendous need. It has increased the options that we are able to offer to the community. But the point is this, it might have failed. No one knew for sure. Only those who risk failure have the opportunity to receive the great rewards. You cannot steal second base with your foot on first. In order to discover new oceans, you have to lose sight of the shore. Observation number 7, failure is where faith grows. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Apparently, it was blowing the whole time they were walking back to the boat. Those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. And looking back over the book of Matthew, it occurs to me that they didn't worship when Jesus preached the most famous sermon ever. That is the Sermon on the Mount, beginning in Matthew 5. They didn't believe. They didn't worship him when he heals a man with leprosy. They didn't worship him when he healed the centurion's servant in Matthew 8. They didn't worship him when he calmed the storm, also in Matthew 8. They didn't worship him when he restored 2 demon-possessed men. They didn't worship him when he caused a paralyzed man to walk. They didn't worship him when he raised a dead girl from the dead. And they didn't worship him when they fed the 5,000. But they did worship him when Peter got out of the boat, when he walked to Jesus, when he looked at the wind, when he failed, and when God rescued him. And Daniel Doriani says this: the moral of the story is not therefore that Peter is flawed because he took his eyes off Jesus. This is the way it is often preached. Peter took his eyes off Jesus. You don't take your eyes off Jesus. Try really hard to keep your eyes on Jesus. Don't look at the storm. Look at Jesus. Look straight ahead. You need to look straight ahead. Try really hard to look at Jesus. And Daniel Doriani says that's not the point of the story. The lesson is that Peter's failure, we're in a lesson asking the question, what if I fail? And the lesson is that Peter's failure does not matter, because even though Peter took his eyes off Jesus, Jesus did not take his eyes off Peter. And you can risk failure, and you can get out of the boat, because Jesus is always keeping his eyes on you. And may God richly bless you as you teach your people to get out of the boat, to risk failure, and maybe even fail at times, as we often do in following Jesus. And may God richly bless you as you teach your people these truths this week.